was Dositheus, and who were the Dosithians? These are the questions that I'm going to be examining today. Dositheus is one of those figures whom we meet in the heresiological literature of the early Christians. And stories circulated about him, many of which were contradictory. He has been associated with Judaism. He has been called a Samaritan and a Samaritan sectarian. He is attacked in all manner of sources. His books were said to have been left behind, but none of them survive. He seems to be clouded in a mystery, related somehow to Simon of Samaria, mentioned often with him, but often not in any clear relation or with any clear historical connection. And so, as a service, I want to present the sources that we have. And since those sources aren't many, I can virtually present them all. But I will be focusing solely on those sources that belong to the Christian heresiological tradition, and only through the 4th century. So for those who are interested in later sources, either Samaritan sources or what have you, going up to the medieval period, I'll recommend some literature at the end of this presentation. As far as I can see, the first source to mention Dositheus is the Christian called Eusebius, writing in the late 2nd century, probably in the 170s, reported only through Eusebius's ecclesiastical history. Eusebius reports that there were 7 Jewish sects, which include the Sadducees, Samaritans, and a group he calls the Baptists. He claims that from these 7 Jewish sects came Simonians from Simon and Dosithians from Dositheus. Neither are directly said to be Samaritan or Jewish, for that matter, and both seem to be a mild threat to Christianity as Eusebius understood it. This is our earliest testimony, showing that Dosithians were a movement, probably in the 2nd century. But this is all the information from the 2nd century that we have. The traditions of Pseudo-Tertullian in the Against All Heresies 1, verse 1, probably go back to the early 3rd century. This work in Latin is itself probably an epitome of a work written in Greek, which was called the Syntagma Against 32 Heresies. And in this work, a Christian work, it begins with the Dosithians. But in its present form, we learn next to nothing about Dositheus himself. He is said to be from the heretics of Judaism. He is here for the first time directly called a Samaritan. And he is said to have dared to reject the prophets as not inspired by the Holy Spirit. But this was a common and perfectly orthodox Samaritan belief. So there's nothing here that would indicate that Dositheus was anything more than a Samaritan. And he is not connected to Simon. The traditions passed on by Origen bring us later into the 3rd century. Origen calls Dositheus a Samaritan and a strict interpreter of the Sabbath, claiming that Dositheus taught that in whatever position or posture you were when the Sabbath began, you had to remain in that posture for the remainder of the day, which would have certainly been difficult if you were bending over, using the toilet, or, God forbid, in the act of sex. According to Origen, Dositheus claimed to be the Messiah, and this is probably the most consistent tradition coming from Origen. Origen also says in his commentary on John that Dositheus, according to his followers, did not taste death, and that his books are preserved. But, to my knowledge, the only book attributed to Dositheus is the Three Seals of Seth, which is a Sethian work and has nothing authentically Dosithian about it. Finally, Origen says that Dositheus claimed to be son of God, and that he belonged to a group of 30 people. This is in Contra Celsum, Book 6, paragraph 11. In the refutation of all heresies, which can be dated with a fair amount of certainty to the early 220s of the Common Era, there is no mention of Dositheus. But there is an important development. The refutator confuses Samaritans and Sadducees in his report on the Sadducees. This report on the Sadducees mostly comes from Josephus, the Jewish War. But at the end of it, we find this additional section in which the Sadducees are said to prevail mostly in the region of Samaria, that they do not attend the prophets, nor any other sages except the law alone, given through Moses, and that they claim not to interpret things. Unquote. The idea that they prevailed mostly in the regions of Samaria is historically false and simply confuses Dosithians, or I should say Samaritans, with Sadducees, and we will see this error repeated among later Christian heresiologists. Eusebius, who was bishop in the area of Palestine, Caesarea, not far from Samaria, in the early 4th century, is the only witness to say that Samaritans were persuaded that Dositheus was the very prophet whom Moses predicted, the prophet like Moses, and therefore presumably a prophet who would do the works of Moses, which might include ascending to heaven, performing miracles, and not dying. And probably from Origen, Eusebius interprets this to mean that Dosithians promoted Dositheus as the Christ or Messiah. But by far the most memorable tradition about Dositheus appears in a work of fiction called the Pseudo-Clementine Homilies. This work of fiction, this Christian novel of the 4th century, purports to tell the origin story of Dositheus and Simon of Samaria. It tells the story of how Simon, called a Samaritan, originated from a group that originally followed John, not called the Baptist, but the Hemero-Baptist, the day baptizer. That Simon went to Alexandria to learn a mixture of Greek culture and magic, and that while he was gone, John presumably died, and Dositheus took control of the sect. But when Simon returned, he, for the moment, kept his peace, but began slandering Dositheus behind his back, which in turn caused Dositheus to confront Simon in a group meeting and to beat him with what appears to be the rod of Moses. When this rod goes through the body of Simon, as if Simon's body were made of smoke, Dositheus becomes afraid and asks Simon in awe, "If you are the standing one, say so, and I will worship you." Simon says, "I am." Dositheus falls down and worships, and not much later falls down permanently in death. The Pseudo-Clementine recognitions tell much the same story with a few additions, but there is another tradition that is passed on, namely that Dositheus is the founder of the Sadducees, who are said to deny the resurrection, separate themselves from others, and not live according to a wage-oriented system of ethics in which people are good for the sake of a heavenly reward. Simon is also said to be of this opinion, but is not directly connected to Dositheus in any other way. This appears to be a completely different tradition than what we find elsewhere in the Pseudo-Clementine literature, and it does not in any way jive well with the tradition I spoke of in the last slide. Finally, we come to the late 4th century, with Epiphanius, who presents Dositheus as a disaffected Jew who failed to become a leader and so became a Samaritan, a tradition that he may have been inspired by from a story in Josephus. According to Epiphanius, Dositheus was a prominent interpreter of the law, which accords with his status as a Sadducee. His extreme fasting was said to kill him. He fasted so strenuously that he died in his cave, and only a few of his followers found him later, covered with maggots and a swarm of flies. His followers are said to believe in resurrection, unlike the Sadducees, and to live ascetically. They abstain from meat and some from marriage. They practice circumcision, fasting, Sabbath, and are strict in not touching anything or anyone impure. The last Christian testimony comes from Pelagius, Diverse Heresies, chapter 4, where Dositheus, who is called a Jew, lives according to the flesh, quite unlike his presentation as an ascetic in Epiphanius. Dositheus is said to believe the resurrection, as in Epiphanius, that it cannot be proved from the law of Moses. He is said to deny spirits and angels and the future judgment, which were classic Sadducean beliefs, and that, and this is the surprising thing, the Sadducees are said to derive from Dositheus via a man called Zadok. This would put Dositheus very far back, earlier than the 1st century CE. And Dosithians, or Sadducees, or what have you, are distinguished from the Samaritans. So Dositheus is not a Samaritan at all, and he lives far before the 1st century, when Simon of Samaria was active. As you can see, the traditions about Dositheus are confused and confusing. In no single source agrees entirely with any other source. The only element that ties Dositheus to the 1st century is his being juxtaposed to Simon. But his actual relation as a teacher of Simon or a forerunner of Simon isn't made clear until the Pseudo-Clementine Homilies, which is a work of fiction and never purports to record historical fact. Nothing of Dositheus really survives, not his writing, not any of his self-testimonies. He is a great question mark. in the annals of history. I'd venture to say that on evidence he probably was a Samaritan, although this tradition isn't always clear. Sometimes he's presented as a Jew. But since he is attacked in Samaritan sources as well, it seems that he was a Samaritan, and a rather strict one. I doubt that he claimed to be the Messiah, because Samaritans do not have a Davidic Messiah. But he may have claimed to be something more like the prophet like Moses. Now, Eusebius is the only one to say this, but if Dositheus was thought to be the standing one who did not die, then this would, in fact, tie him with traditions of Moses. Somehow or other, perhaps due to the refutator or someone else, the Dositheans pick up key Sadducean beliefs, like no resurrection, even though, as Epiphanius points out, they definitely did believe in resurrection. In Epiphanius, Dositheus becomes an ascetic monk-like figure for the first time, which doesn't appear to be too reliable, and a death tradition is added to humiliate Dositheus, and particularly the tradition that he did not die. So, this is how Christians deal with the threat of Dositheus. And we are left with a lot of historical guesswork. And the only thing that I can recommend for you as you peruse this material is to take it chronologically and weigh the sources, as I have here, for their accuracy. Don't trust the novelistic portraits over other sources. Otherwise, we become trapped in a web of fiction and start thinking that we can really reconstruct this figure. In fact, unfortunately, we probably can't. But suffice it to say, this figure remains interesting and important as an enemy of Christianity and another witness to the great diversity of both Judaism and Christianity as it emerged from Judaism in a world of people claiming to be sons of God, eschatological prophets like Moses, and perhaps even messiahs. For now, I want to thank everybody for coming and encourage you to leave a like and a comment if this video helped you in any way or inspired you or caused you to think differently and outside of the box. For those looking for more traditions of Dositheans, I can only point you to the standard monograph, now unfortunately quite dated, but is called appropriately The Dositheans, a Samaritan Sect in Late Antiquity. I can't say that I really agree with the conclusions or the method of this work, but it will give you a taste for the later sources, which will include Samaritan sources, Arabic sources, and others, even as far up into the medieval period. So, take it as you will. Let me know what you think. And as always, take care.